Emily had always been a skeptic, shrugging off the ghost stories her friends loved to share, but her convictions were put to the test when she inherited her grandmother's old house. The house itself was grand, with high ceilings and a maze of rooms, but there was one item that stood out among the antiques and relics left behind: a massive, ornate mirror in her bedroom. It had a dark wooden frame covered in carvings that seemed to twist and turn as you looked at them, forming shapes and symbols that felt wrong. Her grandmother had always insisted that the mirror was special, that it stayed in the house, never to be moved. At first, Emily didn't think much of it. She'd catch her reflection occasionally, maybe fix her hair or check her outfit. But soon, she started noticing strange things. Sometimes, it looked like her reflection moved out of sync, like a second or two slower than her real movements. She tried to laugh it off, telling herself it was her imagination. But every night, the mirror's presence grew more unsettling. When she would pass it, she'd catch glimpses of something, a figure lurking just out of view. One night, as she was preparing to go to bed, she caught herself staring into the mirror again. Her eyes locked onto her reflections, and she couldn't look away. It felt as though the mirror was drawing her in, like it had a mind of its own. She turned to walk away, but a strange sensation made her look back, and what she saw froze her in place. Her reflection was still staring at her, even though she'd turned away. The image in the mirror was smiling, a twisted, malevolent grin that didn't match her own expression. Terrified, Emily backed away, breaking eye contact with the eerie reflection. She tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, but the unsettling events continued. The reflection seemed to develop a life of its own, and every night, she would catch it staring at her with hollow, lifeless eyes. The energy in her bedroom felt heavier, colder, as if something was watching her, waiting. Finally, she couldn't bear it anymore. She draped a heavy cloth over the mirror, determined to end whatever strange occurrences were haunting her. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard a soft, chilling whisper. It was her name, spoken slowly, deliberately from somewhere near the mirror. Her heart pounded as she sat up, staring at the cloth-covered mirror. But to her horror, she saw the cloth slowly slipping off, as if pulled by invisible hands. The mirror was uncovered, and her reflection was back, but it was different. Its eyes were black, hollow, and bleeding. Her own face in the mirror twisted in agony, and the reflection's mouth opened, mouthing words she couldn't hear but could feel deep inside her mind. She screamed, grabbing a nearby object and hurling it at the mirror, shattering it into hundreds of pieces. But as the shards fell, Emily realized her mistake. The dark presence didn't dissipate. Instead, it poured out from the shattered glass. A shadowy figure emerged, slowly taking shape in her room. It whispered, "Thank you for setting me free." Cold and menacing, it advanced toward her, its touch like ice freezing her body. Emily's voice caught in her throat, and as she looked down, she saw herself fading, her hands becoming transparent. The next morning, her neighbors found the house empty, with only a single, blood-stained mirror fragment lying on the floor. To this day, they say that if you stand before a mirror in the house and listen closely, you might hear Emily's voice calling from within, trapped in her own reflection forever. Dr. Jensen was a young resident assigned to the night shift at the old St. Mary's Hospital. Despite his interest in the supernatural, he had never believed in ghosts, chalking such tales up to overactive imaginations. However, the hospital held a disturbing reputation. Rumors spread among the staff about hauntings, mysterious apparitions, and unexplained noises in the abandoned East Wing. One of the nurses, a woman who had worked there for over 30 years, cautioned him one evening, her face pale with fear as she muttered, "Whatever you do, stay away from the East Wing. No one goes there." Curiosity gnawed at Jensen as he went about his duties, and later that night, he couldn't resist the temptation. With his heart racing, he grabbed a flashlight and ventured down the deserted corridors. The further he walked, the colder the air became, as if an invisible force was sapping all warmth from the building. His footsteps echoed through the silence, creating an eerie rhythm against the hospital walls. Shadows seemed to flicker in his peripheral vision, disappearing when he tried to focus on them. Finally, he reached a door marked Ward 7. The nameplate was faded, and the door was slightly ajar, as if someone had left it open in a hurry. Taking a deep breath, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was pitch dark, save for the beam of his flashlight illuminating rows of rusty beds covered in torn, decaying sheets. Dark stains were visible on the restraints attached to the bed frames, hinting at violent struggles that had taken place. A shiver ran down his spine as he moved through the ward, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, he heard a faint moan coming from the far end of the room. His breath caught, and his hands shook as he aimed his flashlight toward the sound. There, lying on one of the beds, was a figure, a woman dressed in a torn hospital gown. Her eyes were sunken and hollow, her face contorted in pain and horror. As he approached, her head turned to face him, her lifeless eyes locking onto his. His heart pounded, and he took an involuntary step back. But before he could react, she began to rise, her movements slow and unnatural, as if she were being pulled by invisible strings. She reached out a hand, her fingers long and skeletal, and her mouth opened in a silent scream. Panicking, Jensen stumbled backward, bumping into a bed and nearly losing his balance. The woman glided toward him, her feet never touching the ground, her eyes fixed on his with a mixture of sorrow and rage. She whispered in a faint, raspy voice, "Help me. Please, help me." Jensen's hand shook as he fumbled for the door, but just as he reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. His scream echoed through the empty ward, but no one could hear him. The woman moved closer, her cold breath brushing against his face, her fingers reaching for his throat. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows across her face, making her appear even more ghastly. He could see now that her skin was pale and paper-thin, her veins visible beneath the surface. Her eyes were filled with a mix of desperation and anger as she whispered, "They left me here, alone. Don't leave me." Jensen struggled against her grip, his heart racing as he pushed her away. But her hold was like iron, her fingers digging into his flesh. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. He felt a cold presence surrounding him, pressing in from all sides, and the woman's voice echoed in his mind, pleading. The next morning, the nurse found Dr. Jensen's belongings outside the East Wing, but he was nowhere to be seen. His name was added to the list of those who had vanished in the East Wing, their souls forever lost in the darkness of Ward 7. Some say that if you listen carefully, you can still hear his footsteps echoing in the empty halls, a warning to those who dare to venture into the forgotten ward. Tom had heard the stories about the Midnight Road, a lonely stretch of highway that cut through an empty forest, known for strange disappearances and ghostly sightings. Locals warned that driving the road alone after midnight could lead to encounters with the spirits of those who had died in tragic accidents along the route. Thrilled by the idea of a good scare, Tom decided to see if the stories were true. He set out late one night, the road ahead dark and shrouded in mist. No streetlights lit the path, and the dense trees on either side seemed to press in, swallowing any light his headlights cast. As he drove, the road grew eerily quiet, the hum of his engine the only sound. A strange tension filled the air, a sense that something was watching him from the shadows. The radio crackled to life, startling him. He had turned it off, yet faint whispers filled the car, distorted voices that seemed to murmur his name. He tried to ignore it, dismissing it as interference, but the voices grew louder, more desperate, as if pleading for help. Then, without warning, a figure appeared in the middle of the road, a woman in a long white dress, her face hidden by her dark, disheveled hair. Tom slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt mere inches from her. Heart pounding, he honked, hoping she would move, but she remained still, unmoving. Slowly, she lifted her head, revealing empty, dark eyes that stared right through him. She raised a bony arm and pointed down the road, her face expressionless. Against his better judgment, Tom continued driving, glancing in his rearview mirror to see if she was still there. To his horror, she appeared closer each time he looked back, as though she were following him. He pressed down on the accelerator, but the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning in unnatural ways. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, he saw headlights in the distance. Relief washed over him, as another car approached, its lights cutting through the fog. As it passed, he glanced over and froze. The driver was a perfect copy of himself, staring back with lifeless eyes. Panic gripped him, and he sped up, desperate to escape the endless loop. Yet the road continued, winding on, and each time he looked in the mirror, the ghostly figure drew closer. Finally, the woman's face appeared directly behind him, her mouth open in a silent scream. Tom tried to turn, but his body wouldn't respond, paralyzed by her haunting gaze. The last thing he heard was the faint sound of his own voice whispering his name. The next morning, the sheriff found Tom's car abandoned at the side of the midnight road. No trace of him was ever found, but legend has it that if you drive the midnight road after dark, you might see a man standing on the roadside, his face pale and terrified, trapped forever in an endless drive through the haunted forest.